Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second talk of today. My name is Julieta Aranda. I am an artist and also an editor at eFlux Journal, and this is the second year that I am programming part of conversations at Basel. I'm very happy to be able to have the conversation today on science fiction and rewriting the future. It's actually important to me that this is done by women and by non-white women, because I think there is a lot to be done with how science fiction has been approached for the past couple of hundred years. So I'm only going to introduce here the moderator, who is Monica Vejo, who is the curator and head of the arts department at CERN, the Hyper Collider in Geneva. And she will introduce the two panelists. I'm a big fan of their work, so I'm really looking forward to what you have to say. And yeah, the floor is yours now. And please welcome the panelists. And by the way, please keep your masks on throughout the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Julieta, and thank you everyone who is involved in the organization. It's been a pleasure to think and to explore ideas around this panel, which I think is very topical, and and I like the introduction as well. So the description of this panel is how I will start. I will reread it because I also completed with some research. So this panel is called Rewriting the Future and Science Fiction and Contemporary Art. Many artists and writers have been, and we have been, dedicated our work to describe the future and the worlds that can be, the worlds that can be created, that can be imagined. But since they are placed in time, the description always comes with an expiration date. And the narrative of Blade Runner, science fiction masterpiece that all of us have seen several times for sure, and an epitome of the hyperreal, takes place in Los Angeles in 2019. It's funny to understand that Akira, which is placed in the metropolis of Neo-Tokyo, is also placed in 2019. But if we go into literature, we see Octavia Butler, The Parable of the Sower, which is set between 2024 and 27, and then The Handmaid's Tale, which is actually written in the 80s and is now broadly new and commented, is set around the 2005. The futures of these speculative and dystopian fictions are described already in the past. And in this panel, we will discuss how the opening decades of the 21st century, we might be in a non-future scenario. So in this future, we might have reached a limiting point for imagining. What is the imagination of this point in time in which we see an arrow moving forward and without affecting the past? Is something we will argue. And however, we will also consider how we hit a reset point, and the future is going to be rewritten through by the arts, by the science as well. Science is rewriting the future and resetting an exploration, an observation point. So our two guests in this panel might help us with these questions, and I will invite them to share their views and how they are working with this subject matter. You will see that we will be using the work of two influential speculative fiction writers that are Octavia Butler and Ursula K. Le Guin. So let me introduce you my partners in crime. Rashida Phillips comes from Philadelphia, is with Kamai Ajewa, the part of the collective of Black Quantum Futurism. In their work, they explore the intersection of futurism, creative media, DIY aesthetics, and activism in marginalized communities through an alternative temporal lens. Rashida is finishing this week the residency at CERN with us, so we've been, for a while talking about topics that will be commented in this panel. Sofia Maria, for me, it's a pleasure to meet you, and is a Qatari-American artist living in London at the moment. Through her work spans many disciplines, including drawing, film, screenwriting for TV, and is united by a preoccupation with the power of storytelling and myth and language, and in particular with imagining revisionist histories and alternative futures. So my first reaction and reflection around this topic is about these films and science fiction writings that we mentioned. They shed light into urgent questions that connect with the so-called progress of society that we thought we were progressing at some place that was rationally defined. And we see that racial issues, extreme capitalism, ecological collapse, resources scarcity and equality, and mayhem are pictured in this film. So what happens beyond dystopia? Where would this reset point be, in your opinion? And this is a very broad question, so give me your answer.
We never talked about who would start.
We didn't have a choreography for this, it's true. I mean, I guess in the timelines of history, it's I would like to go second.
Okay, sure. I think I'll kind of, I guess, answer the question a little bit backwards just by talking a little bit about my work as part of Black Quantum Futurism and how we sort of think about the future and how we question it. And one of those ways is really looking at the future as a construct and as one that is tied into lots of different things around culture and location and where you are. And sort of the tendency of the West to spatialize the future, to see it as something that is conquerable like space and sort of co-associated with space. And so even this question of beyond the future is sort of a spatialized question of like, what does that even mean? And I think in our work, we question it. We question where the future is placed. We question this arrow of time and this progressive sense of the future, because if you look at histories of Black American slavery or even looking at African diasporan cultures and how they think about space, time, and the future is not always in front of us in these cultures. The past is not always behind us, right? In some ways, it's layered in the present. And so I think that's key for us in thinking about what the future means, where it's at, whether we're like progressing into the future, whether the future is now, right? So we sort of unpack those constructs in our work. And so just kind of thinking about what is beyond sort of dystopia, I think part of what we were talking about is sort of the dystopia of the everyday. And that's what we also look at in our work. I'm from Philadelphia, North Philadelphia. It's the poorest, biggest city in America. In my day job, I serve people who are low income, who are facing loss of housing on an everyday basis, and those very real crises that people encounter every day, whether it's personally within their family being kicked out of their homes or its entire communities being displaced. 5 years ago in Philadelphia, in the part of the city that I live in, we had the government take by a process called eminent domain, took 1,300 properties that were owned by low-income people and people who were living in low-income housing and kicked them all out, and then demolished the buildings that they were living in. That was a dystopia. That was a apocalypse for those folks, right? And so thinking about what that means in the everyday is key to thinking about what it means to move beyond that, and not sort of tying dystopia or apocalypse to these sort of big visions of empty space and the whole world is being destroyed, but like what it means for someone's world to be destroyed in the present, and that it looks a lot like what we think of as science fiction, and that people like Octavia Butler and Ursula K. Le Guin were extrapolating from reality. They weren't making this stuff up out of thin air, when we're talking about women's bodies or the ability to control your own reproduction, right? Right now in Texas, right, people who need abortions are being criminalized, and people who take people to get an abortion are being criminalized, right? So it's extrapolating from the realities we're in, and it's not these kind of what we've been sold as science fiction or as dystopian that has to be this big thing that involves everyone in the world, right? It happens on a sort of daily basis. So I'll stop there.
Well, picking up from there, I feel like the extrapolation of science fiction writers has always been, it's like an equation almost that has to be undone. I'm not a mathematician, but it feels like when you're writing into an unknown space, that there is like a necessary beginning, either at a historical point or whatever contemporary moment you're on, and you're in this like often non-consensual reality that we're stuck in. And then, yeah, moving out from there. And I think that that's part of the big, problem with science fiction is that, or speculative fiction, because it just feels like it's not fiction, it's like speculative realism. And in that way, often being, sort of asked to talk about the future is very difficult for me, or about science fiction, because I feel like if we don't go into the past and into history and start undoing a lot of that writing that's already been done, it will be impossible to rewrite the future. So I think it's really interesting that we've both been asked on this panel. We both have like day jobs that we do that are like kind of separate to this world, because I write historical fiction generally for film and television, and I consider that very much a practice of time travel and an attempt to like find the stories that have been erased or find entry points into other ways of thinking about particular historical moments, like for example, like Theodore Géricault's The Raft of the Medusa, and like recentering that story around different characters. For example, the central character in that painting, which is a black man, and that's a very conscious moment in, I guess, European art history of like recentering a story. And it's revisionist history because that image is completely a fantasy. It's a speculative idea of what the raft actually looked like, who was alive on the raft, etc. So I think that like, I'm very curious to talk about like speculative fictions, because I think that it happens in lots of different kinds of artwork and writing. As I mentioned earlier, like whether it's law or whether it's policy or little dream boxes that you might write to try to create a future for yourself. To-do lists, speculative. Maybe not fiction, depends on your day. So, yeah. What moment to break or what moment to start from? Always now.
Yeah, I think on the same terms when I read authors like speculative fiction writers, as they are defined. Octavia Butler is in this arena, and I think when you deal with time, with the structures, with this making of new imaginaries through the dialogue with communities, you are creating you are struggling to create solid foundations that might be performed later in time. It's not working in the present, but is being very conscious about this present. So I think what I find really fascinating about Octavia Butler's work and is how she usually focusing on character, and this character keeps emphasizing dialogue, communicating, expressing, phrasing concerns, and facing as well conflicts. But these daily conflicts that you need to deal with to reset time point. And she does this in thinking and being very aware of a community and these layers that you described, right? So I find this deeply connected to what we face today, the dialoguing, the opening structures, policy making, and this is something you definitely do through language and through your job, daily job practices, but also the artistic practice that you are consciousness or unconsciously doing. So this moment of pandemia that is being commented for the last 2 years, and it seems to be starting to get forgotten, needs exactly this spirit. And we have a chance to go there. So how do you see it? How do you see this dialoguing, these dimensions that you open all the time to create solid policies for a new future?
It's interesting that you bring up communication, I think, in relation to Octavia. Recently, randomly, I reread a short story of hers, and I'm not sure if any of you have read this, but like Speech Sounds, which is interesting because it happens in a pandemic, and in this pandemic, people lose their ability to speak and sometimes read. It's sort of like a motor, like skills, but well, specifically like language, I guess. And I was thinking about how, because in that there's no dialogue, but there's dialogue. There's body talk, there's body language, which is something that I think, especially during this moment in a pandemic, has become, very twisted and changed and difficult, I think. And so finding ways to communicate through our screens in ways that are generative of futures is like a huge task that I don't have any answers to. And I'm really open because I'm learning how to communicate very slowly in new ways and in new dimensions. So if you have that answer, I'd be very happy to know.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think in my work, that is why I'm very closely tied or try to do my work in collaboration with communities as a way to sort of help amplify voices. And I think what's challenging there is that although we speak the same language, necessarily English, right? We don't always speak, and talking about in America, we don't always speak the same terminology, right? And there's different levels and layers of this sort of terminology and what people have access to. And so things like policy making, which absolutely is speculation about the future and creating policies that you don't know, you can only kind of guess or speculate about how they're going to impact people in the future. Often the people who those policies impact and affect don't have an opportunity to have any say. They don't have any input into the things that are controlling and affecting their lives. And so that's why, like, for example, one project that I did in Philadelphia around that same space where they took all these properties, demolished the buildings, kicked everybody out of the neighborhood, opened up a space called Community Futures Lab, where we did what we called oral futures interviews, which was about thinking about sort of the way in which in some cultures we pass down information and pass down history and pass down memory. It's not necessarily written. It's through speech, it's through sound, through storytelling, through manifesting, sort of speaking into existence what you want to see happen and sort of bringing together through your speech the elements that create what you might call a future for yourself. And so being able to create a space where people came in and did these oral future interviews and connected very naturally the past to the present to the future. What they've had in the past, which again often gets left out of the conversation. For this community in particular, the government talked about in a newspaper, you can look it up, about how violent this community was, how poor they were, and so as if they didn't deserve an opportunity to say what they wanted for their own futures, for their futures of their own community. And so being able to challenge that and have people be able to speak what they want to see happen, and then using my position as a lawyer or whatever to sort of amplify that and to embed it in policy is something, it's kind of a trick that I try to do with my work, because otherwise I could do my work in a way that does not include the voices of people and just creates policy that will impact people because I have a certain privilege in my role, but it's not the way that I think things should be done. And so really emphasizing amplifying the community's voice and translating that language, being able to translate the language of policy and government and displacement and on terms that people can understand and connect to and actually envision something different that then gets embedded in these same policies that are going to impact their lives is really important to me.
Yeah, I think there is, and we talk about this, about a character in this kind of science fiction, speculative fiction, which is the leadership of the hero versus the mothering leadership. So in the work of both Butler and Ursula K. Le Guin, we see hyper-empathic characters that they didn't choose to be. And they are, in a way forced to be leading cultural groups and or a species, or the whole planet, or or just a small family. But they assume in these works the difficult task to describe mothering in opposition to this leadership. So they are often childless mothers or heads of community that lead and inspire and suffer the consequences of it. They often are carriers of trauma and the stories of the group. And I find this construction of their narratives very compelling because they change in time and in location in the spaces continuously, while they describe concerns and urgent needs in the groups, in the communities, and they phrase them out in a language that is often disarticulated. So your work, in my view, is trying to convey this as well. So what is our position? What is our past and what is bringing us to us? How do we embody this urgency of changing roles? And so I was thinking, what thoughts, these mothering, characters might provoke on you?
I feel maybe it's interesting because when the word mothering comes up for me, I think very much of this sort of myth of there being some kind of wisdom or like a wise one or even some kind of all-seeing one who's like knows what's going on, knows what fight is happening over there, and it's a myth. And I think the work that you do, like for example, attempting to write something collectively, and writing is traditionally, I suppose, like it's in a way a trap of like becoming very individualized. It's like a moment in history when writing began that meant that it was no longer the speech sounds. We were no longer resounding the future. It became, these codes and glyphs and things that like then trapped meaning and possibility. And so like the fact that is it's a solitary activity, and the kind of work that you're doing where it's like communicating in a community and then gathering it up and then translating it into the necessary structures of like, our particular dystopia that we're living in various places is exactly that for me, and is very inspiring for me in terms of like actual active, maybe not the opposite, like I don't think the word mothering is the word, but I think de-othering people maybe and giving amplification, as you say. I think that's a big thing in terms of ways forward, I think, for what I imagine.
Yeah, I think Octavia Butler, for me, I haven't read a ton of Ursula K. Le Guin's work, but Octavia Butler, for me, as you said, that theme of mothering is extremely present throughout a lot of her works, but not in a way that is not without challenge. I think she really emphasizes the labor inherent to mothering and to this sort of unwanted mothering or unwanted leadership in some ways, or accidental leadership where you're put into a position to have to take it on, and connects that to gender and connects that to slavery in some ways, and sort of that forcing, which I think Ursula K. Le Guin also, right, has those themes, particularly in A Handmaid's Tale. So I find that really interesting, and how it sort of juxtaposes against these kind of stereotypes of women wanting to be mothers, or that's our legacy, or that's always going to be the future for women, or that something is wrong with you if you don't want to be a mother, right? All of those things. And I think for Octavia Butler, it very much ties in again to thinking about American slavery and what Black women were forced to do, having to breed, having to produce children who became slaves, or just not having any control over their own time, their own futures, their own reproduction in this way. So I think Octavia Butler takes that, right, and challenges that in some ways very directly in books like Kindred, where also, there's challenges around gender. The main character there at one point hides like a man and has short hair and just all these different things that signal, right, these alternative ways of connecting gender and mothering and parenting. So she just does that in a really, really brilliant way that I think continues to resonate today as there's more ability to think outside of our sort of standard gender constructs of woman and man and male and female. Like she has always explored those sort of in-betweens, and also thinking about other creatures and blending with other creatures like Wild Seed, where the main character is able to morph into dolphins and to other kinds of creatures, right? So she really thinks about that. And so for me, that is also a theme in my work. I was a parent at a very young age. I had my kid at 14, and so this theme of mothering has come up a lot in my work, becoming a parent when I didn't want to be a parent, or when I didn't even know how to, so becoming this mother, right, and like what that construct means and what's expected of me as a mother or as a parent or whatever. So it's definitely something that rises, but I think in ways that challenge those constructs and those positions.
Mm-hmm. One other interesting thing off of that, though, that does come to mind, I have to say, is that away from the question of mothering, I think one thing that Octavia is constantly in conversation with is like dismantling and ripping down patriarchal structures, or even challenging very patriarchal characters, like, for example, in Wild Seed, where there's like, right, Doro, constantly fighting Doro, or in Lilith's Brood and that Xenogenesis series, where it's like the problem with human evolution is that it's hierarchical, and that hierarchy is something that is like deeply embedded in human males, and that is something that has to be changed and grown out of. And so that's the thing that I also think is like super important and interesting in science fiction in particular, because we've been trapped inside of this hyper-patriarchal 20th century, generally like science fiction canon, that is precisely the reason why we feel that there's somehow suddenly no future. And the reason is that future isn't happening because they were looking at their own navels, basically. And sure, we don't have like the Jetsons, but we do have the parables. And there's a reason for that. And it's the daddering, the fathering. Not a short story I'm gonna write, but it is pretty bad. The daddering.
Okay, this is the moment we need to wait for the announcement to finish. As I've been told. So let's take this moment as an hiatus.
It's very dystopian. I feel like I am in like...
Make sure you have your masks.
Oddly calming. A meditation.
Let's continue. So, why did this thinking about the mothering? I thought of contesting the idea of leadership. So we've been bombarded by what is a leader. You want to be a leader, you will become. It's just the highest expectation in many areas, and at work and the family and with your friends. So it was contesting this idea of leader, and this leader is often alienated, and we see this often, continuously in films, in science fiction. Is alienated. There is some social anxiety related to it. It's confined in a small in this apartment, which is dusty, and they need to get a huge car or something to go and socialize for a minute. So it's this construction of the future that I think we need to contest as well with new roles, and we are actually doing it. I think for me, this is a key point to reset in the future, and I like to hear your thoughts. And the liberating narratives are connected, especially what you do, and in your last project, in your latest project, Sophia. How you are interested in carrying many narratives and spreading them into the world like experiences. So a reality is the way we experience things. It's not a reality that is detached to us. So in your work, Terraxicum, which is now in the Serpentine, in the Sculpture Commission, you are inspired by a dandelion. And this flower says a lot about how it's detached from this central point and diffuse ideas and narratives. So can you comment something about this specific project?
Well, Terraxicum is it's a bastardization of the Latin word for dandelions, Terraxicum officinale. And I was very, very moved a few years ago to start writing in a way that I hadn't before, which was in poetry. And these things were sort of like coming from me, and they were all sort of like longings towards a future and different ways of being and different ways of loving. They were love poems. And they felt like dandelion seeds, like wishes. And so it eventuated that those then became a sculpture in the park, which also was, in many ways, like an answer to a wish for a place to be grounded and for a place to be quiet publicly. And during the pandemic, this sculptural piece took on a different meaning, which was that there needed to be some kind of pilgrimage spot also in London, in a place where the pandemic and the lockdown was very extreme. And so this, and also it's in Hyde Park, so it was also meant to be a sort of foil to the Speaker's Corner, which is traditionally more speculation and pontification. So yeah, it was in many ways like, it's a many-pronged project, which is constantly expanding, and the narratives within it, and by its very nature, it's like very chaotic to talk about. So for example, there's a book element of it. There's a performance which is happening this fall by Tosh Basco, who's here, which is very exciting. And there's a guided meditation. And so these are all ways towards moving away from just telling a straight story, but that it's like coming from so many different disciplines, and lots of different people are involved, and lots of different perspectives. And it's kind of mirroring, I guess, also like the format and the geometry of a dandelion, which, by the way, the best fact that I found out about dandelions over the course of this entire project is that there is a new form of aerodynamics that has been discovered, which the dandelion seed, when you blow it, is a detached vortex occurs, and it's never been observed until, I think, 2008 or something. So, possibly 18. So there are many, many things about that project which are very science fictive, and I guess in a way, and attempting to tell a story without telling a story.
So what happens when the dandelion and the seeds are
Detaches?
detached? Yes. What is the arrow of time and space? Where do they go?
Well, that's just it. It's not something that you can. It's not something that you can model, because by their very nature, they're like chance is the thing that is actually the pollinator in a lot of ways. Whether it's like a cat's fur that's walking by or a little kid blowing a dandelion, there's no way to project all of the probabilities of where that seed is going to end up. It's impossible. But the aerodynamics, I suppose, this discovery is maybe a way to start to do that. But I hope that they don't figure it out. I like that mystery.
Yeah, that is very interesting. But I will not go into the science, because we are always captured by the subliminal aspect of science. So let's stay a bit, if you allow me, with the idea of community and these sparks that you see but you cannot really model. You leave them be liberated. And I'd like to ask Rashida about again the aspect of that. We try to deal with the future, and this is what this panel is about. How do we do it? What tools do we have? But Kelewin reminds us that we cannot. How can we deal with the future if science fiction is made of the present? And you're doing in August. You opened this installation or this exhibition in the called Ancestors Returning Again, this time only to themselves. And this is in the Hatfield House, yes, in your neighborhood in the north of Philadelphia. Is that right?
Yes.
So I'm interested in listening about your idea of reverse time, how time can be transformed into something else with the effort and the different disciplines and the different approaches of a community, like the one is part of this exhibition.
That's it's a hard question, because it's all of my work, right? It's so much of what we do or try to attempt to do through all of our projects. But the Hatfield House is sort of the progression of a project that we have called Temporal Disruptors, which focuses on Black women, scientists, healers, people, doctors who have been left out of history, who have been, if you're looking at history on this sort of progressive linear timeline, right, they're not really included, or you don't know about these women scientists. Some of them lived right in my neighborhood or in my community. And so we started this series of watches based on these women as disrupting sort of the linear time of history, disrupting the sort of trajectory of, again, if you think about Black people's place on the timeline of history, we're always considered behind, because on a progressive linear timescale, we weren't even considered human, right? We weren't considered full humans until a certain period. And so full humans don't get futures, right? We weren't included in the future of the Constitution or the vision of our country, right? We weren't supposed to make it. We were just slaves or objects or something that helped people to do. So in that sense, right, we're always behind. We didn't become human until after we were liberated. And so we're always going to be about 200 years behind on that progressive linear timescale. And so that means that a lot of our achievements aren't included, even though, right, they live alongside of, you hear about certain people, but a lot of them get left out of the conversation. And so that, for a lot of people, limits our imagination of what we think is possible. If you don't know, for me, just speaking about myself, I didn't know any lawyers or doctors who looked like me. I didn't think it was a possibility for me. I didn't know, I've been writing science fiction since I was a kid. I didn't think I could be an author. I didn't know about Octavia Butler, right? I didn't know that my visions of the future would ever be relevant to anyone outside of myself. And so that's why it's really important for us to connect that to community and to show what's possible and to get other people's ideas, especially people who have experienced crisis, trauma, whatever, to get their ideas or their sense of what does the future mean and being able to expand that. And so that's why it was important to have that exhibition. We created a short film based on that exhibition, also using this sort of conceptual device that we call a quantum time capsule. And that quantum time capsule is a time capsule that is not a sort of linear time capsule. So with a normal time capsule, right, it's something that someone in their relative present buries in the present, that contains what will become history, and that, right, moves in a forward fashion, that someone from the future is going to open that and supposedly see something from history. So the quantum time capsule moves backwards as well, and it thinks about, it doesn't just move forward in time, it also can move backwards. And so conceptually, right, someone from the future can bury information or artifacts from the future, send it back to the past, and that could be something that helps someone. And so, for example, I've used that in some of my science fiction, this sort of quantum time capsule, or this way of warning the past, particularly for Black people who have, in America, gone through Jim Crow, going through, lynching, all of these sorts of things. We had this year in America called the Red Summer of 1919, where there were race riots all over America, where hundreds of Black people got killed, lynched, murdered. And so being able in the present to send a quantum time capsule back to 1919 or 1918 and warn my ancestors of what is to come, right, and to give them tools, that's kind of the understanding of the quantum time capsule. So the exhibit focused on that, and we created a short film where you see this quantum time capsule being sort of buried and sent back to the past, and you see the temporal disruptors sort of receiving that and being able to use it in their science and their to predict the future or to know what's to come. So that's just some of the ways that we explore that kind of concept.
Yeah. And what about the tools? You mentioned the tools. What tools? Can you give us an example? What are inside these time capsules? There are resources. It takes me back to the idea of policy making as well. So you create the structures. You create toolkits for liberation,
right?
Reshaping spaces and experiences.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it could be mundane things, like, for example, Kindred, Octavia Butler's, right, when her character goes back into the past, she takes a map. She takes a map from the future to help her navigate and be able to escape. She takes a knife, right? She takes things that both, right, it wouldn't have made sense to take a AK-47 back into the past, right? But she takes a map. She takes these sort of really practical tools. And this is like really based in reality. So like, with the time capsule work, I've also done a fair amount of research on, again, Black people are often left out of these time capsules. If you think about American history and all the sort of time capsules that are celebrated or typically found, they don't contain Black history in them. And so I've had to really do a search around like Black history-based time capsules and what they have in them. And just some really interesting things that you find. So like this one time capsule that was found buried underneath a housing project, an affordable housing project where people lived, that contained information about Black history at that time and how people were being discriminated from housing and being pushed into the slums in different corners of the city. And that's like not something you would find in a typical time capsule. So just like those kinds of tools and artifacts, information about history that's buried or information about the future, again, these kind of maps, these really practical tools, artifacts, which again, that correspondence to reality for Black folks, we're often cut off from our histories. We don't get access to these artifacts. They're based in museums, or we've been displaced or pushed out of our communities, and we don't get a chance to keep the very practical things that could tell us about our history or that could be tools for us. So the tools are really practical, and they're also a way of thinking and conceptualizing. And again, that for me is where we start in some ways of how we even think about the future, how we spatialize it. And once we can undo the notion that it's in front of us or that it's progressive and start to think about other ways of thinking and connecting to time, I think that just offers in and of itself a resource beyond just our normal resources, because the natural consequence of this progressive linear time, if we look at the history of science, right, it's deterministic and we end in the world's going to explode and time is and history is all going to explode, right? But if you don't think of it that way or think of it as fatalistic, right, it just all opens up time and experience and resources beyond what we normally have, I think.
Yeah, you are describing the knives. You are describing a very executive scenario. So you are, not alienated. You are a very, full of courage person, and you go to the past, and you know, or you are kind of knowing that you might need it or you might lose it. But this take me. I listened, Sophia, to one of a talk, and in which you mentioned the back carrier theory of fiction, and this takes me to this. Yeah, you are carrying your tools, you are carrying your experience, and you are opening this up for social, community progress or again reparation. So can you comment on this inspiration you found in this theory?
Well, I think the carrier bag theory is interesting, but it's sort of like implicit in, for example, a time capsule. And the carrier bag is very much, it's not sort of an intentional gathering. It's very sort of more around like random picking up of things along the way and then constructing a story out of those runes. But I think the thing that I'm really excited about and interested in thinking about time capsules and time travel is that you do generally either our bodies are time travel machines, obviously, in many ways. Our histories are a part of that body. The things that we arm ourselves with along the way, one of the most important things that came to mind when you were sharing this story about the affordable housing project discovery is like knowledge and facts. And that's, again, something that's like very prominent in Butler's writing, especially in the parables, because books, for example, become like a very important thing to have access to. Mm-hmm. Or I also think about like if you have like a time-space continuum, which is like constantly being colonized and rewritten for us if we're not in a position of power to do so. Another element of that is literally like POV. So, and POV comes back to the question of writing. So, for example, like a journalistic POV and like questions around what is the truth? Like what are the pieces of information that we can carry with us that will then inform not just ourselves, but everyone around us through being able to communicate or showing it to them or translating it into the parlance of the time. Not on an iPhone in 1817, but maybe in the future. So that's the sort of things that come to mind around carrier bag. Is like there's a big difference between intentional, gearing up to go forward or backwards or sideways. But the carrier bag is fascinating because it is more like the dandelion in that it's just like chaotically picking things up and learning what we can from it and weaving what we can from it. And that's just a very different nonlinear way of understanding it, experience and reality. And I think that's the thing that I find inspiring about that essay in particular, the carrier bag theory of fiction, because in it, Le Guin says like time's killing arrow, and that it is like it's like a deadly, very masculine way of like seeing time and experience in life, and not this impossible to describe thing that is what I feel many people experience. It's just a sort of overflow.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think I'm going to stop here and give the microphone to the audience. We have, 10, 15 minutes for questions, if there are any. So the microphone is open.
Sorry. Hi, thank you. I would just love to hear what Black quantum futurism has been doing at CERN and what your hopes were for that opportunity and how you might be applying that into some of your projects, relating, of course, to diaspora and temporalities, but if anything new has emerged.
Yeah, excuse me, so much new. It's hard to talk about, but the residency has been like absolutely amazing. I've had 3 weeks to talk with physicists and engineers about how time shows up in quantum physics and all levels of physics, and engineers, and look at experiments and things like that. So it's definitely expanded my mind in ways that I'm still processing. But my project is looking at this thing called CPT symmetry, which stands in science for charge, parity, and time symmetry, which is a sort of thing that upholds right in the universe that there should be symmetry between physical systems or particles. And there's also this phenomena in social time of Black people called CP time. So it's the same acronym, colored people's time. And so that acronym of colored people's time has always been seen as a disparaging thing, as something that's bad. It means we show up late to everything. It means, and so I've done a lot of research on that phenomenon, where that emerges from, and again, can trace it all the way back to times of slavery and seeing Black people, and even before slavery, right? We're talking about when folks went out to colonize and enslave people, going to Africa, Australia, right? Just that, bringing that perception of time with them, and seeing, like, if you read these diaries and journals of these colonizers who went, right, they're talking about time very explicitly, like, oh, these people are slow, they have no sense of time, which translates into they're uncivilized, right? And so that carrying forward into American slavery and this sense of colored people's time, which translates into people are lazy, right? And it has very real implications. And so when you look at medical journals and things like that, right, they're talking about Black people's sense of time and how it's connected to health and all these different things. So anyway, exploring those concepts, exploring that what in the science world it's called CPT, symmetry and violations, exploring those symmetry and violations of time in Black culture and Black people's time, and really reframing that sense of CP time as something negative into something that actually both is a survival mechanism, right? And so if you look at during slavery, how people, they actively used time, slowed down time, tried to resist the master's clock, what we call the master's clock, by doing things or by escaping, right? Or using the North Star to guide themselves to freedom and liberation. So looking at those acts of time and temporality, and seeing that CP time as both a survival mechanism, but as something that also connects to our ancestral ways of space and time that feel more beneficial, feel more healthier ways of connecting with time than does the sort of linear work labor clock that we're all attached to, but again, for Black people has a sort of very specific history and meaning. And so the project is essentially kind of exploring those juxtapositions, and what I'll produce, you'll see, just follow our work, but it's turning into thinking about a series of clocks and other objects that can really represent that shift in time and take us away from the sort of linear yet circular clock that is always progressing forward in our culture.
Maybe you need a dandelion clock. Every direction possible. I never knew that that's what they were called until after this. I'm excited about that.
That's complex.
Hi, thank you. So I'm actually a film producer from New York, and whenever we talk about or focus on science fiction, a big thing that we talk about is the storyline that carries throughout. And traditionally, like you guys have touched on beautifully, that storyline is very masculine driven. You know, it's usually a singular hero's journey arc, and there's a battle and this, you know, showdown between good and evil and this singular point of either failure or triumph. And when we look at really following a storyline into the future in different ways, not only through film or television, but even video games, we see it centered more around character and community. And I would just be interested to know, like, how do you guys perceive kind of overcoming that, you know, singular person that's a little bit easier sometimes for a viewer or reader to follow, as opposed to centering a story around a collective or a community in a way that better reflects what we actually see as leadership?
I mean, I think gaming is a really important thing in terms of growing away from certain kinds of like save the cat narratives in film and television, or like these very strict structures that you need in order to get something off the ground, or role-playing games, workshops, therapy, like all of those are sort of narratives that I think are models of narratives and more experimental formats of I mean, therapy is not that entertaining for me, but I think that, like, yeah, games and things like that are important.
Yeah, I find a lot of Afrofuturist works to be really challenging those narratives in different ways. One example is this short film called Pumzi, and not all Afrofuturism, right? For me, Black Panther, for example, although that's like seen as a, you know, a sort of popular idea of Afrofuturism, to me it kind of repeats that same kind of trajectory, and technology is all, and, you know, all that kind of thing. And even I hate the beginning of the movie where it's like Africa was all in darkness until this rock hit it, and then all of a sudden, you know, that's horrible. But Afrofuturism, I think, is really challenging it. There's a short film called Pumzi that is sort of a post-apocalyptic film. But even if you look at that film, there's so many differences between that film and like your standard apocalyptic film. The colors are different. It's very much connected to nature. You find growth, right? There's not necessarily a ending that we know what's happening. It's kind of left very open-ended, which I think is amazing, particularly because, as you noted, right, like particularly in American films, like we always have to have an ending. We always have to know, have the puzzle figured out for us. So I find a lot of hope in those kinds of films, and I in particular, I watch all kinds of science fiction films, but focused on time travel films a lot. And I'm starting to see a lot of different time travel films too. Like typically in your standard time travel films, right, you have the one guy, typically a white male scientist who has a machine or is able to invent a formula and go back in time. And like, what's he using it for? Typically to like manipulate somebody, like get his old love back that, you know, dumped him a few years ago, or just like no moral compass in terms of where they're returning to in time and what they're doing and who it impacts. But you see time travel films now that are starting to emerge that are different, that think about social justice issues, or you have Black people time traveling and choosing to use that power to save someone from police brutality, or just different things like that. Or even if it's not time travel strictly, you see these kind of different temporal landscapes, or how people are thinking about time differently in some of these films. So I have hope in that, and I think, yeah, I think we're starting to see some differences, and Afrofuturism is really paving the way for a lot of that.
Can I say something further to that question? I think representation is like absolutely number one in terms of like who is in the story. But the bigger thing that I think is way more of a problem than what the actual story is, or the format of the story, is the structure of who is paying the money to make the thing, to get it out to people, because that is what stops things. Because you can, you know, we can make things up to a certain scale, and then you get up to a certain scale, and there's literally people telling you that you can't have, the character, have a Black person in this role, for example, which has literally happened to me, and that is the problem. It's the financing structure of film and television, and who is giving the money, and what their reasons for doing anything are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any other question? So maybe we wrap up here. Thank you. I think we touch topics that usually you don't speak about when you talk about science fiction. There are many others that could be for another panel. Storytelling, I think it has been a very important topic. Community, the roles of everyone or groups in resetting the future, and giving a voice, the dialoguing, the continuous, ambiguous, random, chaotic dialoguing without a focused goal, but just for the sake of doing it, because this time capsule has noise in it as well, I guess, because we need that as humans. So I'm very happy to say goodbye. This is an open conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Thank you.